Hello, and welcome to another episode of Talking with the Experts. My name's Mike Nichols, and I'm the Content and Social Media Manager for AEM. Our guest today is Patrick Marchman, an award-winning program manager, planner, and strategic advisor focused on climate adaptation, sustainability, disaster risk reduction, and community planning. Patrick serves as principal at the firm KM Sustainability, and he also serves on the board of directors of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association. And the reason we've got Patrick on today is that we hear a lot of talk about communities adapting to a changing climate, but businesses are in the private sector, they're also being impacted and they need to adapt. And Patrick's done some interesting work in this area, and he's here to share some of his thinking with us. So Patrick, thank you for being here today. Really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
And why don't we just start off having you, I gave you a little introduction, but why don't you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself?
I've been working in the environment, climate, and hazard mitigation fields for about 20 years now. I worked most of the time for various parts of the U.S. federal government and then to work at the private sector. And right now I'm doing a lot of various works. KM Sustainability is an umbrella for all my freelance work. I'm an AICP certified planner for the American Planning Association. And that's me.
I actually have a 2-day workshop coming up on the topic of climate adaptation in the private sector. Maybe you could just give us a quick high-level description of what that's all about, who it's for.
Sure. Up until now, climate adaptation has generally been something that's primarily in the public sector. Everything from localities to national governments have thought about this. The private sector has not. You could Google climate adaptation, companies right now, and you will not see a whole lot coming up. There will not be a lot of companies that will have their plans. A lot of companies will have their sustainability plans, very featured, but they don't really talk about this so much. And I think, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think now is really the time for companies to start taking climate adaptation seriously.
Oh, that makes sense. And that actually leads into my next question. Why now? I mean, what makes now the right time that the private sector really needs to be focusing on climate adaptation as opposed to before or later?
Well, I think the short answer to that is simply the situation is changing. So NOAA does a really good sort of summary graphic of, the amount of billion-dollar disasters that hit the United States, every year. And so you can tell, every year that there's a lot of them, and it's increasing, and it's not just because of inflation. Extreme weather events are statistically showing up more and more often.
That makes sense. You're the expert, not me, but my understanding is there's also legislative pressure to be on board with greater climate resilience, greater sustainability. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a bit of in a roundabout way, but very recently the SEC came out with new climate disclosure rules. One of the things most of the coverage in the media really focuses on sort of carbon, the idea of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and things like that. And that's kind of when the focus has been. But there's some really important language about requiring companies that are making those disclosures to include language about their basically climate risk, which is the risks that climate events and climate change are going to have to their operations, and to really detail sort of what are they doing to think about it, how are they going to address it. There's also language specific on extreme weather. This is something really, really new. This is based on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures series of standards that was established in 20. They've actually wrapped up in October 2020. A successor standard, I think I'm going to get the acronym wrong, the IFSB S2, which is going a little bit more detail, is going to carry on the TCFD torch. But that's been sort of the international standard for a while. And this is now institutionalizing this in the U.S. standards. You've seen this in a lot of other countries, and now it's come to the U.S. And I think, again, I actually just pulled up an article about an hour ago, business publication that said, I think over 90% of investors polled said that these disclosures are actually going to have a positive impact in terms of the information that investors are going to use in terms of where they're going to put their money and such. So I think there's a lot of really positive potential all around.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is interesting. So, I mean, obviously legislative issues are one, but I mean, maybe just take us through a little more broadly. What do you see some of the differences and some of the similarities between the challenges the private sector is facing versus when we talk about the public sector, what we talk about there?
That's a really good question. I think they're different in some ways. The public sector, there's been a lot of language about, the public sector needing to act like a business. And I think that's actually kind of inaccurate in some ways. The public sector is the public sector. It's meant for the public good in general. So you can borrow methodologies, things like that, but they really have to think on a more broad scale. The private sector, on the other hand, like for things, you can think pretty narrowly. Even a large company that has a massive footprint, say maybe hundreds hundreds of franchise locations and such. It's still not going to be as broad as, say, maybe a geographically equivalent, body, political body. And so, so I think that's one of the major, that actually allows the private sector to really kind of maybe focus a little bit more. The private sector also has to think in terms of just pure adaptation. And again, you see this in some public sector operations. You're starting to see this in supply chain, issues and such. But it also, there's a lot more intangible things. You'll see maybe the footprint of the hypothetical franchise operation I just mentioned. You'll see the actual footprint of the facilities, the buildings, the land leased, but you'll also see the processes. Say, for instance, if it was a food chain, you'll see, well, now you think about, well, how does the food get to the table that we're going to serve to the people? And so then you have to go back to well, here's the process and here's potentially the farm. And you can also look at, say, maybe a private sector firm that operates on a remote basis that says to itself, well, we're just not going to have offices anymore, and we're just going to make everyone work remotely. We're not going to have to worry about paying people. Well, there's still a lot of climate risk there in terms of the IT infrastructure, because maybe you may not have an office, but the cables exist, the data centers, the cell phone towers, all those sort of things. Those are things you have to think of. So again, it's a really intellectually fascinating area, but there's and you can obviously say nonprofits. Again, every institution, every kind of institution has its sort of unique risks, but climate does touch a lot more than you might think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great, thank you. You've touched on this in some of your responses already, but I think it's worth diving a little more deeply into. In your upcoming workshop, the description says that resilience in the face of climate change, it's a business imperative. It's not only for survival, but it's a strategic imperative. It can drive actual long-term success, help businesses emerge as leaders. Tell us a little bit about the thinking behind that.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. One of the reasons why I talk about upsides a lot is because there are upsides. There are, one of the really interesting things about our economic system is that there is the flexibility of it. And so, the trade-offs, a lot of times we think of trade-offs almost, we use that in sort of a negative term way, but, the trade-offs also can, you go sort of, there's going to be a winner as well. And so a lot of the things is, institutions that really want to think about this, every crisis creates an opportunity. So you can look at, and you can see this throughout the history of business over and over and over and over again. That's, even something that may be apocalyptic in one sense turns out to be the greatest opportunity for others. I think back to a great example is sort of the back maybe years ago, cities were full of trams were coming, which were really nice, but there were still a lot of places that had a lot of horses. And there were a lot of concerns that, how are we going to have enough horses? What are we going to do all the horse poop? I mean, it was a serious concern. Like, we've got a smelly city, we've got all this stuff, and what are we going to do? And so you kind of looked, then these crazy people came along with the idea of like these horseless carriages, right? Like, why would anyone do that? It seems expensive. And people kind of pushed through it and they figured out which was going to work. It wasn't like a foreordained thing that this was going to happen, but people took their opportunities and had some ideas and, they tried different things. And ultimately, for a lot of reasons, something happened. And so maybe 50 years on from that, a city would be utterly unrecognizable. And so then so that solved the horse issue, have to live on the horse farms. But then, now there's different issues, and there'll be different things that we talk about right now in terms of like consumption of oil, pollution. And now you're thinking about how else are you going to do that? So again, everything sort of has its opportunity. And I think it's really one of the things about business is that, you can't, the businesses that try to really milk things to try to stick where they are, generally, I mean, there's a wisdom in doing what you're good at, but there's also a danger to make sure that doesn't go into complacency, because you're complacent and you don't think about only things you want to think about. Those businesses don't last very long.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So that's just about it for our time today. I did want to give you, if you've got any final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with.
First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I just want to remind anyone, if anyone is interested, the workshop, go check out my LinkedIn page. My name, Patrick Marchman. I've got some links up there. The session is going to be really interesting. It's a first for me, an experiment, but I think, again, I'm really looking forward to it. I think it'll be a great format for people to really get some targeted help, at least expand sort of range of possibilities. So it'll be fun. It's going to be with Collider in Asheville, North Carolina. And it's the name of the session. It's Future Proofing Your Business.
Great. Patrick, thank you so much for being here. Really do appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. I know you've got a lot going on, so really appreciate you carving out a little time for us. And with that, it is time to bring our conversation to an end. And also, thanks to all of our listeners. Thanks for tuning in. I hope our conversation helped you learn something new about climate adaptation and why it's so important, not just in the public sector, but also the private. So until next time, this is Mike Nichols. We're talking with the experts and AEM.